Manchester City, a big fat club with a big fat trophy cabinet. UEFA, a big fat governing body with a big fat desire to govern. It's a battle for the ages, or at least the 2010s, and it's a battle in which recently Manchester City struck a deafening blow. Because if you can remember back to February 2020, when there was absolutely no other news to read, everything was fine, UEFA concluded its investigation into Manchester City, charging them with having seriously misled European football's governing body and broken financial fair play rules. They banned the club from the Champions League for 2 years and sanctioned them with a hefty £30 million fine, or 3/4 of one Nathan Ake. Manchester City, of course, immediately announced that it would appeal the verdict, and for the months between February and July, everything went quiet as the Court of Arbitration for Sport prepared to review the case. Then, on the 13th of July 2020, the final verdict came. The Champions League ban was overturned entirely, and that hefty fine came down to just £10 million, or 2 Benjanis. So, what actually happened? So, to explain this, we need to go back in time to the year 2010, when Mark Zuckerberg was Time magazine's Person of the Year. Apple released its first ever iPad, and Manchester City bought James Milner, Mario Balotelli, Alexander Kolarov, Jerome Boateng, David Silva and Yaya Toure. They were simpler times, but they were about to become complicated, because that year UEFA also introduced financial fair play. Now, UEFA is European football's governing body. They organise and own all European football club tournaments like the Champions League, Europa League and that other one, and in 2010 they introduced financial fair play, or FFP, which would be phased in over 5 years. FFP was devised as a response to the perceived culture of accepted financial risk within the game. In 2009, a UEFA report found that over half its member clubs were operating at a loss, i.e. club owners were spending beyond their means. Its task was to regulate club spending across the board by measuring outgoings like wages, bonuses, transfers and dividends against income like ticket sales, TV money, commercial revenue and the sale of players. Whereas before there were no restrictions on how much a football club could spend beyond its means, now, across a measured period of 3 years, clubs are not allowed to lose more than a set amount. Pre-pandemic, that was €30 million, as long as 25 of that was covered by an owner. And it's largely been successful. In the first decade of the 21st century, there were 34 instances of clubs going into administration in England. And that number reduces to 12 in the second decade, 9 of which were in the first 3 years of that period. So, you see, FFP is a bit like fire alarms. They're ugly, annoying, you have to keep replacing the batteries and people come to your house to look at them, but they do mostly prevent you from burning to death in a horrible house fire. However, there was another intention behind FFP. Speaking upon the announcement of the regulation, then UEFA President Michel Platini said that the new rules would stamp out what he described as financial doping. And this is where our story becomes interesting. It's 2008. The proton beam is circulated for the first time in the Large Hadron Collider. Mario Kart Wii is released, and Manchester City bought a player who thought he was going to Chelsea. But they did do something else that summer. They found themselves some new owners. Enter Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan, 5th son of the Emir of Abu Dhabi, Deputy Prime Minister of the United Arab Emirates, and half-brother to the President. This guy is rich, and he spent like money was totally insignificant. It was. He really is very rich. In their first 3 seasons under new ownership, Manchester City spent a reported £440 million on incoming transfers. It was marginally behind the entire top 4's combined spend within that period. So, very obviously, financial fair play was not good for Manchester City. Their spending was producing amazing results on the pitch. In fact, it only took City's new owners 4 years in charge to win the Premier League for the first time. But FFP directly impacted that strategy. The club had spent £600 million on players, recouping just £155 million from sales revenue in the same period. So FFP really was the natural enemy to Manchester City. And for supporters, that was understandably frustrating. Their new glory years were being threatened by regulation largely put in place to prevent in-the-wind owners leaving football clubs on the brink of bankruptcy, and less so invested owners with the clear desire and financial backing to improve their teams. The obvious argument against FFP is that it solidifies the status quo. Teams with a history of success on the pitch had already used that success to make lots of good money that FFP said was good through revenue streams allowed and encouraged by FFP, but before FFP, and therefore had lots of money to spend now on the basis that they did it all before FFP. And that really doesn't seem very fair. And predictably, in 2014, Manchester City, one of those clubs with lots of bad money that FFP said was bad, fell foul of FFP. The club made losses of around €180 million in 2012 and 2013, well beyond the allowed 45 million. City claimed that to be the result of differences in legal interpretation, but nevertheless agreed a deal with UEFA that included a series of punishments for the club, agreeing to limit their losses, freezing their wage bill, reducing their European squad size, and paying a fine of £49 million, plus limiting their net transfer outlay to £49 million for 2 years. And that might have been the end of Manchester City's dalliance with FFP. Except, of course, it wasn't. Like a moth to a flame, with both UEFA and City being both the moth and the flame, the dalliance trundled on. It's 2018. 2 Russian men visit Salisbury Cathedral. It's really tall. It is tall, Canadian zoo owners are charged for taking a bear out for some ice cream. And Der Spiegel publishes emails and documents in the Football League scandal, which suggests that Sheikh Mansour bin Zayed Al Nahyan was largely funding Manchester City's Etihad Stadium sponsorship deal himself. But let's rewind for a minute. You see, as Manchester City's spending increased, so too did their commercial income. In 2008, commercial income for the year was about €21 million, but by 2013 it had risen dramatically to about €169 million. Yes, the club had won the league at the end of that period, had a much bigger international profile and plenty of the world's best players to stick adverts on, but a lot of that newly raised income came from one deal in particular. In 2011, the club signed a 10-year-long deal with Etihad Airways. The agreement was for City's stadium naming rights, and it brought in a whopping £400 million. At the time, it was the biggest naming rights deal in history, and for comparison, Arsenal's Emirates deal was for £90 million over 15 years. Now, naturally, this deal went a long way to enabling City's additional spending, or at the very least, keeping the rate of loss down. So in 2018, when the allegations of foul play arose in Der Spiegel, UEFA paid attention. The allegation was that City's owners were deliberately obfuscating proceedings during UEFA's 2014 FFP investigation, with leaked emails allegedly showing a conspiracy to deceive. UEFA launched an investigation found against City in February 2020, and we know the story from here. So, how did this turn around? Well, unsurprisingly, it's complicated, and the official judgment is 93 pages long. But it does offer 2 important and seemingly contradictory rulings. The first, that UEFA did not in fact prove that City were disguising extra funding as sponsorship payments, aka whoops. The second, that City obstructed the original investigation, that UEFA did have a legitimate basis to prosecute, and that their case was by no means frivolous. Seb, what does this all mean?
As it sounds, Joe, it means that City weren't found guilty, but the UEFA weren't wasting anybody's time by bringing a case against them. Also, City made it as difficult as possible for UEFA to investigate, and here is Matt Slater to tell us how.
So City repeatedly failed to produce unredacted copies of the emails, the emails in question that Der Spiegel published. UEFA's investigatory chamber asked for them several times, and City maintained this position that it maintained all the way up to CAS, that these emails had been stolen, and they were not going to do anything to corroborate or deny their existence. They didn't feel that was on them, so they certainly weren't going to do UEFA's work for them. And that did actually come back to haunt UEFA later on in the process, because UEFA kept asking, and then right at the last minute, when we were getting around the when's this CAS hearing going to be, they were really, really worried about the start of this season, and they didn't insist right up until they almost dropped that request in the interest of speed, and I think that was a tactical mistake, because then it looked like to CAS as though, well, how badly did you really want those emails? And a really important part of the whole judgment and how you reach these judgments is what you can reasonably infer from something. Now, the whole point of UEFA's stance in many ways was, well, look, City have obstructed us in several ways, and therefore we can reasonably infer that they are hiding something. Well, then when City turn up at CAS and give everything up, the reasonable inference is almost the other way. Well, look, can you really reasonably infer that? Because look, now they have produced everything, and also you didn't, whilst you asked a few times, you didn't insist.
Okay, here are some of the key findings. According to the CAS ruling, Etihad fully complied with its agreed payments to City, and the sponsorship agreement between the two was fair value. In other words, there's no evidence to suggest its payments actually came from City's parent company, Abu Dhabi United Group, or that the income relating to that deal was overstated. Secondly, the accusations made in relation to a deal with Etisalat, in which again the value of the sponsorship was allegedly inflated, could not be considered because they were time-barred.
Time-barred is a sort of pretty sound legal principle in that you're on the clock. You've got a certain amount of time to bring this to court, for justice to sort of be done. Otherwise, the courts would be permanently tied up. We'd never get anywhere, and you'd be constantly sort of redoing history.
Also in its judgment, CAS determined that the hacked emails from football leagues were allowed as evidence. Project Longbow was not sufficient proof of a conspiracy.
What is Project Longbow, Seb?
Well, Joe, according to the Spiegel, Project Longbow was City's pet name for the measures used to elude FFP. According to an internal email sent by Simon Cliff, the club's chief legal advisor, the name Longbow was used because it was the British weapon of choice in defeating the French at Crécy and Agincourt.
And that really was the crux of the issue. Central to the case was whether UEFA had shown that £200 million of Etihad sponsorship payments over 3 seasons had actually come from Sheikh Mansour. And by a verdict of 2-1, CAS didn't believe so, and City are now back in the Champions League. So, what does this all mean for FFP? Well, club football watched on with interest as UEFA brought its case. Does the governing body really have the might to hold clubs far wealthier than itself to account? Some might not think so now. But whatever the truth, the details of this outcome are too nuanced to be anything other than a tribal issue. Forget about the reality, most people think Manchester City crossed the line here, and that UEFA are just too toothless to punish them. So, nobody wins, really, except Manchester City, who very obviously did actually win. So ultimately, FFP may fade away over time, or more likely, UEFA take a more appeasing and cooperative approach, focus on the good that it has done and the number of clubs that it's protected, and spend a little less time chasing immeasurably wealthy dragons. And to play us out, here's the wonderful Matt Slater with more examples of time barring. Just look how happy his little face is.
Now, the time bar issue took up an awful lot of time at CAS. It was a 3-day hearing, and it takes up an awful lot of the written report as well. And if you like arguments and if you like law, it's a good read. How you construct an argument. I'll try and do it as quickly as I can. So obviously UEFA were trying to drag the time bar as far back in history as possible, right? So when can we? What's the earliest we can look at stuff, right? And then of course City were trying to take it that way to get as much time barred as possible. And they had a good old ding dong about when does the clock start? Does it start when we started the investigation? When we make the when the judgment was delivered? In the end, CAS disagreed with both parts and went for something in the middle. Okay, we're going to start the clock when you officially charge them. Now, having spent 10-15 pages doing that, God knows how many hours it actually happened in the courtroom, in the arbitration room, it didn't matter. It didn't matter anyway, because for UEFA to win that bit of the argument, they also needed to win this second bit, which is, Well, look, the nature of financial fair play is we look at 3-year accounting periods. So let's get it back as far as we can anyway. But anyway, we're going to then we're going to go 5 years plus 2, because we need to get it back to 2011, 2012. Because when you were reporting in 2013 or 2014, you are referring back 2 years. Now, CAS disagreed with that on a 2-to-1 basis. Now, lots of the key decisions in the CAS verdict, there are three arbiters, and a lot of them broke down 2-to-1, 2-to-1 majority. And this is like the first key one where you have that disagreement. The 2 said no. It says in the rules 5, not 5 plus 2, it's 5. It's not, we can't artificially extend your time barring. No, unless you've got an amazing reason, and we don't think you've got an amazing reason here. So no, it's 5. That immediately knocked out all of Etisalat's stuff, those emails, because Etisalat, the emails, the implication that the sponsorship wasn't from Etisalat, in fact it was from Sheikh Mansour or another one of his companies, referred to 2012 and 2013. So as soon as CAS had decided it is 5, never mind where we start it in, if it's May 2014 or February, whatever, it's not going back to 2012 and 2013. So you can forget that. Etisalat goes, the first year of the Etihad debatable bits goes as well. So time barring removed all of the Etisalat allegations and the first year of the Etihad allegations.